Hello everyone, and welcome to this Supply Chain Sustainability School webinar on Biodiversity Net Gain. And my name is Ross Brimmer. I'm a consultant with Action Sustainability. We are the delivery partner of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and we've got some great speakers to talk about net gain. Today we've got Dr. Julia Baker from Balfour Beatty. We've got Rachel Giles from the Wildlife Trusts, Polly Bonneton from Mott MacDonald, and Vicky Patton from Rambol. So they'll be introduced later on in the presentation. But yeah, really good range of speakers to talk about net gain and how it's going to affect the construction sector going forward. So I just wanted to give really brief introduction to the Supply Chain School. If you're not familiar, we are essentially a kind of mainly online now platform that provides free learning resources for primarily in the construction sector. Basically what we want to do is kind of work with some of the kind of bigger organizations who are our partners and the members who are more smaller organizations to drive and develop sustainability knowledge across construction. At the moment, we have around 42,000 individual learners and over 100 partners in the school. So, we're growing and we're providing now more and more of these kind of online events to talk about specific issues and specific hot topics in construction and sustainability. Just to give you an idea, these are some of our partners. So, some of the really big players in the UK construction sector, from Balfour Beatty, Network Rail, National Grid, and others. So why is biodiversity something we need to talk about in the school? It's one of our core topics. It's one of the kind of fundamental elements of sustainability that affects the construction sector. We've got lots of free learning resources on our website available to upskill members of the construction sector on biodiversity, and actually one of the things we're looking to do at the moment as well is develop a new e-learning module which introduces what biodiversity is and why it's a key issue for people in construction. So look out for that.
Great. Have my slides popped up? Yes, they have. Fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you and run this session on biodiversity metrics. So a quick introduction, and just to make sure we are all on the same page. What is this thing, biodiversity? Well, it's the variety of life. So it's all the habitats that we work with, the animals, not just protected species, but the little fellas as well, such as the butterfly and inverts that always don't get the spotlight. But it's so much a part of our world whenever we build the infrastructure or whenever we work within the natural environment. So what is biodiversity net gain? Well, there's a great definition here. And this is development that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than before. And that is great, because what it means is, because that development has happened, and that might be a housing project or a railway or a road project or mixed use or social infrastructure, because that's happened, our natural environment is better off, and measurably better off as well. And there's a lot behind that, and there's a long journey to get there, but that's essentially the aim, and that's essentially the end point that we're trying to get to. And that is underpinned by industry's good practice principles for development as well. So why is biodiversity net gain important? Well, back in 2019, several organisations, institutions and companies recognised that we can no longer continue to degrade the natural environment. And there was joint climate and biodiversity emergencies declared. And with these declarations and calls for action, and it was very much a part of the media and very much a part of the discussion. And we had that incredible movement with the plastic free, with, so much of it was in our thoughts. So why is this particularly important for construction, for our industry? Well, actually, quite recently, the planning policy frameworks, this is very much here in England, was updated. And many local planning authorities currently now in England require biodiversity net gain for projects seeking planning permission. So even if you're not part of an organisation who made that declaration, it's actually part of our world in terms of building development. Now, while that's certainly a great step, and it's a requirement for some local authorities, it's not for all. And this is where the draft Environment Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, will mandate biodiversity net gain for all developments in England that seek planning permission. So for us in industry, it's either with us at the moment, or we might be working for a company who's made a declaration, who's voluntarily committed to biodiversity net gain, or it's certainly on the horizon. So it's very much a part of us. But there's one really other important reason why biodiversity net gain is important, and that's as we emerge from COVID-19. The calls for a green recovery, the calls to put the public health agenda front and centre, and the calls to connect people with nature to support public health have never been stronger. And certainly we in industry have such an important part to play, not just our green recovery, but also in ensuring that we build the projects that we build with a healthy and thriving environment. So biodiversity metrics, I mentioned that biodiversity net gain is all about measurable outcomes. And today we will be discussing how we measure those outcomes, and that's using a biodiversity metric. And this has certainly transformed my work. Now, what's really, really important to note is that you cannot put a single number on nature. So yes, we use a metric, and believe you me, I love a graph, but this is about nature. So a metric's only part of the information that we need to make good ecological decisions, and that requires good ecological information. But the metric does really transform my work. We can set targets, we can track progress towards those targets, we can forecast, we can demonstrate delivery, and all of that improves decision making. So no longer is that ecology problem the last thing on the list. We can be up front and centre, and in a very important but also beneficial way for industry. So this is the metric, and thank you for the polls. It's quite good to know that even though so many people have been involved in net gain, you might not have been involved with the metric, and this is certainly where I spend a lot of my life. It's essentially an Excel spreadsheet. Now, this was produced and developed by Natural England, so again it's a little bit England focused. But this is the one that will be mandated as part of the Environment Bill. And there's a couple of things that I want to draw out before we hear from our experts. Firstly, that it's all about habitats. Everything we do with biodiversity net gain is essentially about habitats. And I know from working in the ecology industry to date, normally the discussions around dormice or great crested newts or those protected species, but we're really coming back to a place when we are thinking about habitats. And I love that. It's that ultimate build it and they will come type approach. So you enter your habitats, you get a score, and it scores various things. You enter area and other things as well, like condition. And essentially you have your units. So it comes up with these habitat units. So it looks at all your habitats before works. And then you would go through the process of net gain. Can you avoid habitats? Can you reduce your impacts? And go through that process. And then you'll have various habitats after works. So again, the metric will calculate those after works units. And essentially it just says, what's the difference from before to after works? So while that's quite simple, there's quite an interesting question. How much? How much do we need to achieve biodiversity net gain? And the Environment Bill has given that to us. The Environment Bill says, okay, it's a minimum, a 10% increase above your baseline. So the moment that you enter your baseline, the moment that you have that data, you know, you can forecast what you need to achieve that 10% increase. And in very practical terms, what does this mean for biodiversity net gain? It's all about habitats. So that means the options to get to net gain are creating more habitats or making existing habitats better. So if you have to explain net gain to anyone, it's that. More or better habitats. That's such a central part of what we do. And for that, we need space. So really early on in your project, if you're thinking about net gain, you need space. You need space to make this work. there's a couple of metric rules that I just want to go through before we talk to our experts. It's really important, these rules, and they're part of good practice. You never sum everything together. You know, this is about nature, and it's about making those key decisions about nature. So it's not about a single total number of units, but rather follow the story of your habitat. So follow woodlands, follow grasslands, follow scrub, and really have that understanding. And that's really important as well, because it's not about swapping habitats to make up the numbers to get to that 10%. It's not that at all. So if you've lost some priority woodland, you can't just score the units with ponds. It is inherently a good practice approach. But let me now introduce our first series of experts. And let's start with, we're going to start with Rachel. So Rachel, would you like to quickly introduce yourself to everybody?
Yes, hi everybody. So I'm Rachel Giles. I work for the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. I'm the evidence and planning manager there, so I do a lot to do with development, planning consultations. I've done a fair bit to do with district level licensing for Great Western Utes. Did a lot of work with Natural England in the early stages because Cheshire was one of the early rollout areas. But for the past 5 years, I've been concentrating really on biodiversity net gain, and really it's it's been a real game changer, as we'll probably go on to talk about.
Yeah, so it's certainly changed my world, you know, not just the net gain, but the metric, you know, and we have to be really careful with the metric and use it appropriately, you know, with ecological decisions, but just getting that, you know, having that quantification, taking out the guesswork. So that's from my world, but I'm Balfour Beatty and a contractor. You're, you know, advising planners. So has it been a game changer for you?
Yeah, so absolutely. So like you say, we obviously work a lot with local planning authorities. The Wildlife Trusts are non-statutory consultees, and we're occasionally subcontracted to local planning authorities to provide planning responses. So we do have quite a lot of influence over planning decisions, and it has made such a massive difference. I mean, in particular, there are developments where previously we would have objected, but where we can see that biodiversity net gain can be achieved. The grounds of the objection may disappear completely. That's not to say that it's just a case of looking at the metric. We are very much focused on looking at the good practice principles and making sure that when biodiversity net gain is submitted, as a metric is submitted as part of an application, all those principles are being applied. And if those are applied, then it often does lead to the point where we wouldn't object on applications where in the past it would have been more difficult for us not to put in an objection.
And it's that ultimate outcome, isn't it? So I guess in very, very practical terms, you know, I mean, you're the one, if we've got an ecology consultants on board, we'd submit, goes off to planning somewhere, and you're the one who actually reviews it. So are there any handy hints or advice you can give maybe people kind of listening in today on what do you want to see in that report? What do you want to see in the metric, you know, for you to be happy with that?
Yeah, there are lots of things we look for, and it's probably worth mentioning that when we look at when a planning consultation falls on our desk, the metric is, and the supporting report is often the very first thing we look at, because we can extract an awful lot of information out of that metric in terms of, you know, how big a development is, are there any priority habitats on the site, and if so, has the mitigation hierarchy been followed? Has biodiversity rich green infrastructure been incorporated into the design? So it's a really useful tool for us, and it provides a focus for us, and then we can go on to then look at other things. But yeah, I mean, there's loads of things that I can go on to talk about if you want, you know, things that we would kind of focus in on initially. I mean, would you like me to?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I'm interested actually. What's your top three?
I wouldn't I would say, broadly speaking, I have got a top three, but they fall into two camps. They kind of the two sort of areas where we concentrate our efforts. So one is there any undervaluation of the baseline value of the site? And the other, is there any overvaluation of the site post-development? So those are the two things that we really want to tease out when we're looking through a metric. I'd say probably for us, the initial thing we're looking at is overvaluation of the baseline habitat. So, or post-development. So, for example, are the proposals for habitat creation ecologically justified? That is one thing that we really, really do focus on. So is that habitat in that location, in that condition, is that justified? The second thing we might focus in on is, does the management plan commitment match the time required for the target to achieve its condition? Obviously, when this is mandatory, things will change and there will be a 30-year period. But at the moment, what we're seeing is a lot of schemes coming through where we've got a 10-year management plan and a commitment for 10 years, but then a 30-year period for a habitat to achieve time to condition. So that will be something else, a handy hint. Don't make sure that your management plan period matches that time to condition. Obviously, like I said, things will change post Environment Bill. The third one are condition and distinctiveness values justified by the supporting information. So we want to see that support, you've got your metric, but we want to see that the information in a report. We want to see species lists. We want to understand how you've made those decisions about, what distinctiveness is the habitat and what condition is it in. So those are my top three, I would say.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's the metric, and it's out there, but it's the accompanying report from what you were saying, making sense of the numbers, having that ecological justification underpinning that, having the data. So is it that kind of, so you can cross-reference? Is that the thing?
Yeah. I mean, we've had metrics sent to us. We've had planning applications and then metrics sent to us as an afterthought, and we've just sort of said, well, it's not good enough. Can you send us the supporting information? We can't go through that metric without that supporting information. It doesn't stand alone. You've got to have justification. You've got to have that information, and particularly a lot of this is about skilling up in botanical skills. I mean, that's the last thing we're finding at the moment. The people haven't, or there's some of the metrics that we've been having, just it hasn't had the botanical information in there to be able to justify those decisions and a lot of money is at stake.
And I really, it's such an interesting one, isn't it? Because for so long we've been like bats and great crested newts, and now we're like, oh, hang on a sec, it's like botanists are really having their day. I was like, we need you, come on. But it's certainly and this is my industry, like thinking about us and our skills and getting really good habitat data out there. Are there any frequently made errors that you see time and time again popping up in the metric?
I think probably one of the most common ones is the thing about 2 decimal places. The metric can't cope with more than 2 decimal places, and that one does come up a lot, and it can completely mess up the rest of the metric if you try and put in 3 or even 4. I mean, it is quite difficult on small sites. And another thing that we do pick up on a lot is the use of the word fairly as well. I mean, it's not so much an error in the numbers, but it's when we have the category that's fairly good or fairly poor or whatever. Those are the times when we want to go back and say, well, why have you said fairly? Why isn't it good? Or why isn't it moderate? Why have you said fairly good? So those are the things that I would say are quite common and that pop up again and again.
Yeah, and just for everyone listening in, the metric has this thing when you enter area, like I showed on my slides, 2 decimal places. Honestly, I'm with you, Rachel. I see that all the time. If you enter more than 2 decimal places, you just get loads of errors. And I'm also with you, Rachel, on that fairly thing. There's a few amazing botanists that I completely trust to do fairly, but otherwise it's just that, it's just quite subjective. And and what I'm hearing from you is that you need the justifiable, you need the credibility behind it. It's not just the numbers, it is about the natural environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the numbers is the reason why this is so important and why it's made such a massive difference being able to measure outcomes. But sitting behind that is everything else, all the justifications. We can't just look at the numbers.
No, exactly. We still need those ecologists. So,
Yeah,
Rachel,
definitely.
thank you so much. Right, well, speaking about we need ecologists, I can't think of anyone better to ask than a brilliant ecologist, Polly. Polly, can you come online and introduce yourself?
Hello, Julia. Hello, everybody. Yes, hi, I am Polly Boynton. I'm an ecologist for Mott MacDonald. I've been with them for the last 7 years, based in Bristol. And I've been fortunate enough to work with Julia on a little handful of B&G projects since about June last year. And I'm really enjoying it. It's really interesting. It's one of the reasons I enjoy it so much is that I've always believed we need to preserve habitats in order to conserve species. You can't. There's no point breeding and collecting dormice if you've got nowhere to put them. So habitats first, and I'm really pleased that B&G facilitates this.
Isn't it great? I know,
Yeah.
I know. I'm kind of loving it. So we've heard some from Rachel about the wish list, the asks, if you like, what she wants to see. Now you have been brilliant, really working at that kind of number level. So from your perspective, from your kind of ecology point of view, are there any real pitfalls? You know, if people are just getting to grips with this, starting out, what would be your advice about the pitfalls with the metric, or the pitfalls to the work, if you like?
I mean, first things first, I would definitely suggest that anybody allows budget to purchase the Ordnance Survey mapping tile for your development. It can seem expensive at first, but not buying it, I think, is a false economy. Because having the OS master map means that your mapping, in order to fill out the metric, is much more accurate. Your features that you draw will be aligned with the base mapping, so you've got no risk of overlapping, which is really important when you come to your area calculations. If I could just share some slides.
Yeah, go on then.
This is an example of where. Can people see that? I don't know if I've done that right.
Not yet, but it should be coming up.
Sorry, bear with.
The joys of Zoom.
Yeah, sorry everyone. Can you see that now?
I think we'll come back to the slides. I think there's a...
Okay, there's no joy with that.
Do you want me to share them, Polly?
Yes, please, Sophie, if you could. Perfect, thank you, Sophie. So the reason I'd say that buying the OS master map is so important is, in this example, I've got a river drawn over the aerial base mapping, and then the same river drawn over using the OS master map tile, and they don't look necessarily any different until you overlay them. And in this example alone, there's an area discrepancy between the two of more than 2 hectares. And these inaccuracies can have a significant impact on your biodiversity units. The other benefit to having the base mapping is that when you receive design drawings or proposals, these will match up perfectly with your habitats that you've mapped, which is really helpful when you come to your next stages of the assessment.
So it's really interesting, isn't it? So this is about habitats. So that, I suppose, you know, for small or large projects, actually getting that essential habitat map, is that your kind of key starting point?
Yes, I definitely say so.
And if someone's got a heap of like phase 1 survey data, and they're now looking at that metric, the Excel spreadsheet that I showed, where would they start? What's your advice in kind of work on that very practical level?
That's a good question. So when you receive a whole bunch of GIS data, I think the most important thing is to make sense of what you've got. Sophie, can we have the next slide, please? So the first thing I would do would be to separate out my data into shape files. Is it possible to have the next slide as well? Sorry. So the thing that I found, the system that I use, which works best for me, is when the metric and the mapping align with each other, so they contain the same elements. And on this slide, you can see that the metric has a separate tab for each of the 3 habitat categories initially in the baseline. So your first shapefile, or layer 1, is your polygons, and these correspond to metric tab A1. These are area-based habitats, and they are measured in hectares and drawn as polygons. The next stage, the GIS data that you've received, you'll probably have some hedgerows. So I'd start another shapefile, and this would be your linear habitats terrestrial, and this corresponds to your on-site hedgerow baseline, or metric tab B1. This is measured in kilometres. And then finally, if you've got any aquatic terrestrial habitats, aquatic linear habitats like rivers, these are also measured in kilometres, and they correspond to tab C1. So that's how I would start with making sense of the data that you've received.
Yeah, and it's such a good way of laying it out, isn't it? So your first, those green, brown and blue boxes, that's in the metric. So you mirror that in your GIS.
Correct,
Have
yes.
different layers for those different aspects.
Yes, definitely.
So it's setting that up, I suppose, setting up the system, getting that plan in place. Do you have any other tools or anything else that you can give people advice on?
Yeah, so one of the other benefits to separating it out into these 3 different tabs is that within ArcMap, which I use, each of the features that you draw, so every polygon, every line, is assigned a unique reference number. Sophie, could we have the next slide, please? So here you can see that every polygon's got its own number, which corresponds to a row in an attribute table, which basically contains the data that you then want to extract for your metric. And having a system like this means that eventually you can cross-reference between the map and the metric very easily. And I'd say that it's very important to make sure that your mapping is as accurate as possible before you populate the metric. This is going back to what Rachel was saying earlier about how the metric's quite sensitive to if you put too many decimal places. The metric also manages everything in rows, and those are in consecutive rows. So if you change the mapping habitat numbers, you then have to change the rows in the metric to make sure that they stay corresponding, but you can't insert or delete rows. So any changes that you make can be quite complicated in the metric. One of the ways that I manage this is by having a separate working data spreadsheet. Sophie, if we could have the next slide, please. So this is just a snippet of the working data spreadsheet that I use. So within my spreadsheet, you have a tab which pretty much mirrors what's in the metric, but you also have your working data, so you can work out what ditches are within which parcels, make sure that your decimal places are rounded so that they fit with the metric. The other thing is that when you are in the metric, it's got quite a lot of complex formula, so you don't want to be messing around with it. You want to keep it nice and enter it one time, sort of thing.
I know, and it's quite sweet, isn't it? But it really is quite sensitive. And I've certainly loved the way that you just have it in a kind of a dump Excel file,
Yeah.
and you can manage it and you can work around it. And despite all of that, I still love the fact that you love Biodiversity Net Gain, because that's the detail of the number crunching. So from that, really. It's a very practical view, and everyone, honestly, Polly has just been absolutely fantastic in this work and looking at the details with that. are there any kind of final, for people just starting out, or maybe they might be working with the ecologist, to understand that level of detail, particularly as you follow the story for the habitats? I guess, are there any final pieces of advice that you could make?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one to suggest, but the earlier you can be engaged in the project, I'd say would be the better, because of those difficulties in translating your mapping into your metric. You really want to have all the information before you start doing your mapping. So I'd say if you can get involved early on, you've got a better chance of being able to influence the design, or earmark areas of your site where you might be able to achieve more biodiversity units. I think having someone with environmental knowledge at the start of a project is key, really.
Definitely. And how do you manage that balance between being involved early, which is amazing and great because we can just sort of set them on the biodiversity net gain path, while also then thinking about your number crunching, and every time they go down a slightly different route, you're going to have to update the metric. So how do you find that kind of balance?
It's tricky. It's like a chicken and egg situation. You don't want to have everything perfect and then they say, oh, we're actually going to put a building here where you've already planned to have a pond. So if you can have sort of rough areas of your site where they are definitely going to allow for biodiversity net gain or habitat enhancement, or rough areas where they're definitely going to have housing being built, I think if you can separate out zones maybe within your development, that would be a good starting point.
Definitely. And for everyone else on the call, the other one is have someone as organised as Polly, because she just knows every single parcel that we've ever worked on. So Polly, thank you so much. We'll come back to you at the end for any final questions. So our last expert is Vicky. And Vicky, would you like to quickly introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, and thanks to the school for inviting me to speak today. I'm Vicky Patton. I'm a biodiversity technical specialist. I'm also the UK lead for Biodiversity Net Gain in Ramble. I've worked in biodiversity for many a moon now, biodiversity conservation, and I have to say Biodiversity Net Gain is one of the best tools that I've seen for development. Not just because it works for biodiversity, but it can work for development as well and be very positive for developers. So I think we're all agreed in that when we come across biodiversity net gain. Yeah.
So I'm going to keep quite practical, if you like, because I know obviously with Ramble you work with teams of ecologists. So people listening in today might not be ecologists, but they will work with that kind of army of ecologists out there. And this is different, we're coming from a place that's mitigating damage, protected species, that kind of place. We're now at a place where we are designing development to achieve biodiversity net gain, and we're doing so with really, really good it should be, essentially a habitat approach. So kind of your role working with ecologists, what advice would you give people on the webinar in terms of, starting out and working with that lot?
The starting point for net gain really has to be, apart from communication with all the full design team from the get-go to understand what net gain is and the aspirations for it. But in terms of the ecologists that are undertaking these assessments, it's to gather the data and gather as much data and as you can, and make sure that data, you're comfortable with the data and that it accurately represents the site. And that means now going out to site, when we do our habitat surveys, we used to send our more junior ecologists out to site to do the habitat surveys, and then the more experienced ones out to do the protected species surveys. And that's really changing now, where, as you said, Julia, we really need our botanists out on site now to get these baseline assessments done for habitat for biodiversity net gain. So organising your data, and that means organising the data in terms of the baseline, but also, as I'll talk about in the slides, your construction data as well, what you know of construction works and what will happen on that site. So
I guess it's quite an interesting change, isn't it? I mean, you know, and we've got to be proportionate, of course we have. And, you know, we're talking with people who some might work on larger projects, some might work on very, very small projects. But I think the key essential point is get your habitat map. So even if you're a small project, even if you're a large project, because if you don't, A, you won't get that efficient organisation that Polly has, and B, you won't get the level of information that Rachel needs to sign off planning permission. So is that kind of starting point key for you?
Absolutely, yeah. That's where it all starts from, and that's where the assessment is hinged upon. That baseline biodiversity assessment, that full understanding of what's happening on site, and it's not just an understanding of what habitats you have on site and what condition those habitats are in, and that's certainly essential for plugging that through the metric. But it's understanding the value of those habitats and the wider appreciation of how they're interacting with maybe species that are using the site. So it's, as much as net gain is a quantitative assessment, we don't want to step away from that qualitative arena as well, and make sure that when we develop a site that we're still maintaining the connectivity through a site, if that was there before, and if it wasn't there before, that we're improving on it. So yeah, absolutely getting your baseline information so that you know what the site's providing at the moment for nature, and making sure that it can still deliver on that after development, regardless of what we're developing in there.
You know, yeah, I mean, I love a metric, but it's not just about the metric, it's about nature as well. So I suppose it's kind of a similar question, but if we think, okay, that's where we've been, this is biodiversity net gain, and I know you've got some slides, so do go through those, you know, about the main difference between that and, you know, the practical advice that you can give in terms of, okay, this is now net gain, this is where we are now.
It's a constantly moving field, yeah. Let me just share my slides, and we can go through it. You let me know if you can see that okay?
Yeah, looking good.
Yeah. So I'll actually talk specifically about the contractor considerations and construction works in particular. What we need to think about, as we said, it's an evolving field, and I think at the moment we're doing fantastic in that we're looking at the baseline scenario and landscape. I think this middle ground of what happens during construction is not always picked up. So I've put together just a very, very simplistic development timeline, and highlighted in blue there, circled in blue, is normally where we come in with the net gain assessments and consideration of biodiversity. And it's normally at the planning application stage, isn't it, where now, because of change in planning policy in England, and now with the Environment Bill coming in as well, we're certainly being requested more and more often to do a biodiversity net gain assessment, and it won't be long before it's mandatory. So that's where we come in and we do the assessment, and we look at, as we've just been talking about, that baseline biodiversity assessment. We look at what habitats are currently on the site, and we quantify that based on all of our surveys. We then quite traditionally now in biodiversity net gain, we look at the landscape plan, and we look at where the built development is going to be, where the green space is going to be, and what that quality of that green space is going to be as well. So what kind of planting plans are involved in that green space, what kind of habitats might be developed in that green space. And we generally work with landscape specialists to really enhance that landscape plan where we can, and make it deliver for nature as well as everything else it has to deliver for. And as Julie said earlier, it's yourself, Julie said, it's really, we look at the before and after works to get to the assessment, and that's in simplistic terms, isn't it, what we do? But there are parts within that we need to consider, and as a growing industry, we're maybe not considering quite as well, and that's the construction impacts in there. But as we move down and we get planning consent granted, and then the principal contractor comes on site, and we have the construction works. The site then gets developed, and we have the landscape plan is implemented, and the site is reinstated. We then maybe come back in for the biodiversity aspects to then set out the habitat management plan to make sure that the biodiversity can fulfil its aspirations, really. But if I move to the next slide, this is where we need to be sure that we're involved as well. And I think as an industry, we're not quite there yet. I think we're just starting to really find our feet in terms of making sure that we're covering all impacts. So that, as I say, it's the construction impacts. Consider them when you're doing your design. Consider them, how much information is there, and I'll go through that in the slides. Also in the contractor's principal contractor is commissioned, there should be a handover of the biodiversity net gain design, because more often than not, the planning consent that's granted is going to be conditioned upon achieving that biodiversity net gain. So the principal contractor needs to have that information and the design plans that are going to achieve that. And the next stage is construction works. Designs can change. As we know, nothing is set in stone. Construction works designs may have to change once things go to site. So that again needs to be worked back in and considered in terms of the biodiversity net gain assessment. And I say for those construction works plans, and this comes back to the gathering the data while you're also gathering your baseline data, when you start to think about what's going to happen to that baseline and what's going to happen to the habitats on site, don't just consider then that landscape plan, that final plan, consider what's going to happen in the interim during construction works. So speak with the developer and find out exactly what information is available. Is there information on the location of access tracks, on the location of temporary settlement ponds and cut-off drains, of soil storage bins, which for a major construction site can be significant, storage yards, welfare cabins, car parks, all of these things on a major site that's maybe running for a couple of years. The footprint of all of these temporary construction areas can actually be larger than the footprint of the final development itself. So it's not enough for us to go from the baseline biodiversity mapping to the landscape mapping and not consider the impacts of construction in the meantime as well. And it's just coming back to that point of knowing what's happening with every polygon within your map. And there's additional questions in that data gathering exercise. How much of the site needs to be cleared? Do you need to clear more to get ground levels? What data actually isn't available and won't be available until the principal contractor is commissioned. And that's fine if a lot of this data isn't available, but capture that in your reporting, add that as a limitation, because then it means as things move on, that information can then be worked in to the assessment once it is available. And this is where the kind of construction information gets worked into the assessment. We've talked about understanding the story of each habitat polygon on the site, and there's only so many things that can happen to a habitat block, if you like. It can be retained, and it can be retained with no change in the biodiversity, or that biodiversity might be enhanced. It might undergo something called accelerated succession, which is really just changing a poor grassland to a woodland habitat. So those three areas, it could be retained, or it could be lost permanently. It could be lost permanently to the development. But the other one that I've highlighted in blue here, this is where your construction losses come in. This temporary loss of habitat, that then after construction, those temporary construction areas are removed, habitat is then created, and that goes through the metrics slightly differently. So we need to capture that. We need to make sure that we're having a look at that. So that's for doing your actual assessment at the planning application stage. When it then comes to the design handover, so the principal contractors come on board, the construction environmental management plan has been written. That management plan should ideally include the net gain report. And as good practice, it really should include maps of areas to be avoided. So that habitat that we've said should be retained and that is getting either enhanced or there's accelerated succession, that habitat is key to delivering the biodiversity net gain. So we need to tell the contractors who are coming on board where that habitat is and that actually it needs to be avoided. And that also is within that map highlighting the replaceable habitats. A biodiversity hotspot map is great if you can produce it. Again, it would be very much a good practice thing, but that shows again if construction works need to change on site, it shows contractors where the valuable areas are for biodiversity and where the less valuable areas are that could maybe accommodate changes in storage yards. Obviously the landscape plan as well, so sufficient detail in planting mixes. And a contractor really, when you get all this information from the developer, I would say have a look at all the information. Is it deliverable? And if it's not, go back to the developer, have those conversations. And I think that's key to biodiversity net gain. I think you'll agree in that, Julia. It's all about conversations. It's all about front loading this as much as we can, understanding which each discipline needs in terms of the design and what they need to achieve and making it all work together. And lastly, include the metric possibly as well. And as I said, it's before my final slide, plans plans can change on site when it goes to construction. The things that you might have accounted for in your net gain assessment, that might actually change. Access track locations might need to change because of ground condition. Access tracks might become permanent after discussions with landowners, you know, where an access track's maybe going through the land. And that goes through the metric differently on whether it's temporary lost and recreated habitat or it's a permanent loss for development. Things like settlement ponds, temporary settlement ponds, that's going to become a key one as we experience more and more flooding. Settlement ponds are on site during construction to capture that sediment laden runoff from construction while the development's there. Do we need to increase capacity of those ponds on site? That might happen during construction, during, you know, if we know that extended rainfall events are coming up, or maybe that they're just not performing well. These things can change and sometimes have to change. And that's not a problem, but we need to be able to reflect that back in the net gain assessment. So can we update the net gain assessment? And if so, who should that update be done by? Should it go back to developer? Did that stay on the contractor? And if so, does the contractor need to cost for that? And these are all things that we need to think about in industry, and we're certainly moving towards that area, and that is being done in some areas, but it's probably a focus moving forward as net gain continues to evolve. So really the key thoughts on that, Julia, really, I think you'd probably agree, early engagement with the contractors, it probably makes your life easier as well. In Balfour Beatty, as early as we can bring contractors on, the better. And bringing on that expertise to see, is the net gain designs, are they actually achievable on the ground? You know, sometimes you need that expert input to understand that. Transparency, you know, just listing your limitations. If all the construction information isn't there, list it in the report so that it can be incorporated into the assessment at some point. And go back there to that information being in the KEMP is critical for your contractor. If you want to achieve net gain, your contractor needs to know what the aspirations are for net gain. And lastly, you know, as I say, if the designs change, the net gain assessment can be updated to ensure the net gain is still deliverable.
Vicky, thank you so much for that run through. That's, you know, an incredibly sort of practical take on where we are, and some really, really good advice. And, you know, I certainly echo everything that you were saying. So can all the experts come back on? We've got some really good questions that I'd like to get your thoughts on. So Rachel and Polly, if you can come back on. There's been a few really good questions about what we've been talking about the balance between really good ecological data and then the numbers. You know, we can't put a single number on nature. So it's great, the fact that we're looking at habitats, but it's not all of biodiversity. Rachel, can I start with you? What's your thoughts on, you know, that balance between having the metric, you know, having that 10%, and then knowing that it's only a proxy indicator and making decisions about a development, because that's essentially, you know, that's your world, isn't it? Having to know where the impacts are and whether it genuinely achieves net gain.
Yeah, it is difficult, and that's the thing to appreciate, is that it's not absolute. It's you know, it's a proxy, isn't it, for biodiversity. And certainly where we're looking at designs that are only just achieving the 10%, and in some areas, including Cheshire, we're not necessarily, well, the local planning authorities aren't yet asking for the 10%, they're just asking for no net loss. And those are the ones where, you know, we really are sort of drilling down into the metric and looking at you know, areas of error, really, because clearly, even though you know, biodiversity net gain might be claimed in the metric, if looking at the figures and looking at the supporting information, that's not the case, or it is marginal, then those are the flags for us, really, as an organisation. And we want to see biodiversity net gain bring about real changes. We're in a real crisis, excuse me, at the moment, as everybody knows, you know, climate, ecological emergency, and using biodiversity net gain to address these bigger issues is key for the wildlife trust. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on site. I know a lot of this is about achieving that biodiversity net gain on site, but if it can't be done on site, then the Wildlife Trust are very supportive of landscape scale conservation off-site, you know, pooling offsets and doing something really good in the wider countryside is important for us. Yeah,
absolutely. And Vicky, there's one possibly for you and also for me to think about. How can we ensure that contractors have the adequate skills and guidance to deliver biodiverse baselines? And I know especially that what you were talking about the conversations about moving in forward and everything. You know, what's your advice in terms of this? This isn't a shift, you know, it's a shift from that very basic phase 1 to biodiversity net gain. What's your advice in working with contractors?
It's a really good question, isn't it? I'd say for some of the larger sites where you maybe have an environmental clerk of works, make sure that environmental clerk of works is trained up in net gain as well, and they can double up and also keep an eye on that and help you deliver on it. I'd say for the smaller sites or sites where it's not appropriate to have that, potentially upskilling some of your employees just in some of the basic training courses on biodiversity net gain to get a handle on what it is. And where you need outside help, there's a growing field of ecologists who really are experienced in biodiversity net gain as well, who can offer that assistance and advice really on achieving net gain.
Absolutely. And I think actually you've raised a really good point. It's not just, you know, the kind of ecologist at the front as well. It's, you know, the ecologists throughout the project life cycle, and touching on that as well. And Polly, one for you. We're kind of used to those phase 1 surveys, you know, and sometimes even just that very basic ecology constraints, you know, I always hated that word. Is that enough? Where you know, and I know you've talked about your ideal world, we have to be proportionate, of course we do, but is a basic phase 1 enough?
It's another good question. I personally don't think it has the information that you need, the detail. Ideally, you'd have the condition assessments, sorry, that are advised, and you need them to be done properly. If they miss data, then it's very difficult to make your condition selections. But saying that, we have worked on a few where we have only had the phase 1 data, but then you just, as Rachel and Vicky were saying earlier, you just have to caveat that the data you've got is not perfect. So that if you were to repeat the assessment with the correct data or the full data, then you might get a different result.
Yeah, and taking that proportionary approach, you know, I think like Rachel was saying about, well, you've got to elevate the value of the baseline because you don't have the data to start with.
Correct, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's not just a very basic type of habitat like the phase 1, it's the condition of that habitat as well, and making sure that we are using, you know, digital technology to make the most of our time on site, but also then capturing that information as well. There's a good question here about do you see the market for biodiversity credits developing over the coming years? And just a quick one for me, I guess, definitely, you know, definitely we've, you know, this is already part of our life. You know, there's several local planning authorities looking at this already, requesting it. And we know the Environment Bill, you know, for our work in England, the Environment Bill is going to come in and mandate this. And the approach is definitely what can we do with biodiversity net gain on site or very locally. But I certainly work with a lot of very, very tight site footprints as well, and sometimes it's just not the best thing for nature to kind of squeeze it in and cram it in, and that relates to my point about needing space. So I think the market is a really interesting place, and it will certainly be interesting to see where that develops. But I think yes, that's definitely going to come across. There was one about and I think I want to touch on this because all the old problems that we've had as an ecologist, you know, being last in the line and all those things haven't really gone away. And there's a question about, well, what do you do if you get to a site and it's been cleared? And what then do you use as your baseline? Rachel, I'll come to you, but just really quickly for I think Amy wrote that. In the Environment Bill, it specifically references that. So it is in the Environment Bill, and there is going to be a rule about that, about what ecologists use. We'll have to wait to see what the details come out with, but they didn't want people to suddenly like mass clear development sites to lower the baseline for net gain. So when the Environment Bill comes in, that is definitely, hopefully, you know, there's something a bit stronger there. Rachel, the here and now, what would your advice be to ecologists in that situation?
I'd certainly look at things like Google Earth, have a look what it was like 5 years ago, because I think that's the period that will be in the Environment Bill. I might be wrong on that. So what should go in the metric is what it was pre-clearance. And you've just got to use your skills to be able to estimate that, or to the best of your knowledge, if you're an ecologist going out there. It is something that does happen quite a lot. We do see it quite a lot, and use a precautionary principle. Like Polly said, those values can always be revised down at a later point if more information comes to light. But yeah, use the precautionary principle, because it probably will be picked up by somebody further down the line, and that could lead to very expensive delays, of course.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But it's certainly been a kind of a safeguard for me to know that it is specifically in the Environment Bill, and we'll have some text to point to. And Vicky, one for you. You talked about connectivity, so I want to pick up, and someone's made the question there. In the metric, there's this placeholder for what will be about natural connectivity. So, and I love the way the Natural England are doing this. They're not only recognising your type of habitat, the condition, but it's placed within an ecological network, and how connected is it? And while I love that, I'm equally frustrated that we don't have that tool yet. You know, it's kind of works in progress in development, and to be fair to Natural England, they've kind of been a bit busy. But without that in the metric, knowing that we're playing a bit of a waiting game, you mentioned connectivity. How do you, I suppose, have net gains without losing that connectivity?
Yeah, I think it's important to, when we do the net gain assessment, we often just look at the red line boundary. And we focus, you know, the assessment obviously within that red line boundary, that's what captures all of our data. But when we go out in the early days for our habitat assessment, the phase 1 or UK habitat assessment has been buffered out. So have a look at the habitats around the site as well. Have a look in aerial photography as well to see what habitats surround the site, and see what habitats you might want to link up in the final development, and make sure that there is that habitat connectivity. So it's just looking wider from the site. And I think that what we also do is we start to consider, if we're creating habitat connectivity through a site, do we also want to create connectivity for people to walk through a site as well? And it's bringing in that additional health and wellbeing aspects that is increasingly becoming talked about as well. So there's a couple of different boxes you can tick by doing that, but it's an easy one to do, just looking wider than your site, and trying to work in connectivity if you can.
I think so, because anyway, if we miss it, Rachel will pick it up. So we've got to pick it up at some point. But thank you so much, a massive thank you to Rachel, to Vicky, and to Polly. I've loved talking to you. I always love working with you, and to kind of have your thoughts on what is a key aspect of net gain, but it's not the only aspect, and a very, very practical way, but also that kind of, you know, where's the direction of travel? How are we going to truly get these biodiversity net gains? So thank you. I really, really appreciate this. To sign off, and before I hand back to Ross, we've got loads of questions coming in. So for everyone, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to absolutely everything. We'll try and see if we can post some responses. But the other thing as well is get back to the Sustainability School and ask them to deliver more webinars on biodiversity net gain. Definitely, it's such an important topic, and really specific about what you want to hear, what would be most useful for you. But Ross, if I can hand back to you.
Yep, no problem. Thanks, Julia. And yeah, just to echo that as well, you know, we'd be more than happy to run more events like this. And you know, it's up to our members really. If people want to hear about more about net gain and biodiversity, then let us know. We can absolutely have more of these type of things and go into more detail and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I suppose just to sign off, I just want to say thanks very much to the speakers as well. I think it's been a really useful and really kind of productive session. So really useful. I've made lots of notes myself. And yeah, on the questions side of things, Julie, what we'll do, if it's okay with you, is bring together a kind of synopsis of them, and if we can kind of include a response in the slides or something like that, I think that would be good.
Absolutely.
So Yeah. Okay. So, but yeah, with that, yeah, like I say, thanks everyone for attending, and yeah, look out for the slides, and hopefully see you on another webinar soon.
Bye everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks.